Welcome back to the Pursuit Podcast. I'm your host, Jessica Rose. All this month, we've been looking at how to learn to code or how to learn to do something new. Today, we've got a very special guest. I'm here today with
Saron Yitbarek.
Saron, today we're talking about sort of learning to code and the value of a community. I think that you've built a really impressive community. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. So I started CodeNewbie. We are the most supportive community of programmers and people learning to code. And we are all over the world. We are at all different skill levels and backgrounds and interests. And our common goal is to support each other and to hopefully become programmers and practice the art and skill of coding.
So yeah, it's a happy, friendly group of newbies out there just waiting for you, dear listener, maybe?
Yes, I like that.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you got started? What was your motivation?
For starting the community, CodeNewbie?
For starting CodeNewbies.
Sure. So when I learned to code, I learned on my own first. I did a couple months. I quit my job. I treated it as a full-time job. I spent 12 to 16 hours a day just doing nothing but tutorials and online resources and reading books and such. And it was such a lonely, frustrating process. I was in my apartment by myself, alone. I didn't really have people who were going through that journey or people who understood why turning the background yellow was so exciting. And so it was hard, but it was also easy to internalize the difficulties of it and say, man, if I can't get this to work and it's me versus the machine and the machine is always right, then I must be stupid, right? Like it must be me. I must be the thing that is broken. And then a few months after that, I enrolled in a boot camp. And when I got there, there were 44 other people who were just like me. And there were 44 other people who were just as excited about code and just as frustrated as, with code as I was. And I said, it's not me. I am not the problem. The problem is that coding is just inherently a new, difficult thing that I'm not used to and I'm still figuring out. And it gave me an opportunity to externalize a lot of the frustrations that I had. And that was incredibly empowering and incredibly motivating. And what sucked about that solution is that if you can't quit your job and spend thousands of dollars to do a boot camp program, where do you find that community? Where do you find your people to help motivate you and push you when things are tough? And at that time, it felt like everybody was doing a Twitter chat. I'd seen so many of them on my feed on like a daily basis. And I thought, Twitter chats are a really great tool to get people together and has a very low barrier to entry. All you need is a Twitter account and you just need to know the handle. So on Wednesday nights from 9 p.m. to 10 p.m. for 1 hour, I started tweeting different questions related to code using the hashtag CodeNewbie. And that kind of took off. After about 5 months, I said, I think we're going to be here for a while. I think people are going to keep coming back and keep wanting more of this. And that gradually turned into how do we have more in-depth conversations about coding? Because Twitter chat's great for connecting people. It's not great to kind of deep dive. I mean, you could try to have a real conversation, but you'll probably end up angry. And so what is a better mechanism for that? So podcasting came out of that. And then it became, it's great to have this online community, but I would love to meet some of these people. So then we had meetups and then we had a conference. So just basically listening to the community and figuring out what are the pain points, what are the struggles, and creating solutions for that.
So it sounds like you've moved from a very, very specific thing. I want to make sure that other people have the chance to connect, just like I did, with a Twitter chat, something really self-contained. And yeah, just to reiterate, you've got a conference now, you've got meetups, a huge web presence. How long did all this take?
So our first Twitter chat, I think, was 2014, I think it was. So like 4 years ago is when it was the first Twitter chat.
Oh, that's 4 years ago. Oh my.
4 years ago. Yeah.
Ooh.
But it wasn't until, I think it was a year after that, SitePoint, which is a company, I think they're based in Australia. After we'd done the podcast for a few months, they emailed me and they said, hey, can we give you $200 to do like an ad on the show? And I was like, I can make money from this? That's interesting.
They just called to be like, hey, do you want some cash? That's not a bad deal.
Yeah, I was like, oh, yes, please. And so that was the moment where I thought, oh, maybe this is something more than just like a Twitter chat I do for fun while I have a quote unquote real job. And that's when I started to take it more seriously. So it was about like a year in, I think, maybe a little more than a year in. And then about a year and a half after that is when there were just too many projects to keep up with. And I said, and at the time I was working at Microsoft, and I said, I kind of either need to decide that CodeNewbie is going to be a fun side thing I do because it makes me happy, or it's going to be a serious like job. And if it was going to be a serious job, then I needed to take it more seriously and do it full time, because the number of projects that I was doing for CodeNewbie, it was just taking up so much of my time that all I could do was stay in place. All I could do was kind of keep up with it, but there was no room left over to grow or think of new ideas or really serve it and do it justice. And so at that point, I said, you know what, I think I want to invest more in CodeNewbie and I want to take that more seriously. So I quit my job at Microsoft about a year and a half ago. So that to me is like when it became like a real thing.
So, wow, this is your full-time gig now. How exciting is that to have a side project where you help people that's so in demand that you get to do this all the time?
Yeah, it's really neat. It's really, I feel very lucky to have kind of stumbled on something accidentally that has turned into more than what it initially was supposed to be.
So what do you call the people who participate in your community?
Community members, I guess, code newbies. We call them code newbies. And that's kind of the great thing about that name also is people started saying everyone is a code newbie. And that kind of became like our motto in a way, because whether or not you've been coding for 10, 20 years, if you're learning a new language, you're a code newbie. If you're learning a new framework, you're a code newbie. You know, there's always this beginner mindset that is just inherently part of being a developer. So no matter how old you are, how many years you've been doing this, there's always a moment where you come back to feeling like a code newbie.
And that's really fantastic. It sounds like it makes self-identifying as a newbie a lot less potentially scary.
Yeah.
If you've got these grizzled folks who've been in the industry years and you're saying, oh, I'm a newbie at this.
Absolutely.
So can you tell me a little bit about sort of what experiences within your community tend to look like? Do folks start learning to code, they follow through the first time, and they just, boom, in 3 months, they're working as a dev?
Oh, I wish. No, that's the dream, right? That's like the dream they sell you. But I think the reality is, and especially I learned to code now 4 or 5 years ago. And it's really interesting, I think, how much more complicated the journey is. I think there are a lot more stops along the way to becoming a professional developer than I think there used to be. I think there probably was a time, maybe a short-lived time, where you could just learn to code for a couple months and get a job. But nowadays, I just don't think that's realistic. So for our community members, it really depends on their background. It depends on their job. It depends on their income. It depends on how much time and money they have to invest in this journey. There's so many different variables. I've seen people who have an easier time transitioning if they can stay at the same company, right?
Yeah.
So I have a lot of stories of people who started by doing customer support and then were sitting next to the developers the whole time and then slowly poked their head in and said, hey, like, can I look at some of your features? Can I look at some of your code? Like, what is this? And they kind of learned alongside of these developers and with some of the mentorship. So that transition into incorporating a little bit of code into the job they already have is a lot easier. And they're obviously going to be the first to hear about new positions and new openings and such. So that's like one avenue that works for some people if you have that opportunity. Apprenticeships and internships are thankfully being a lot more available to non-CS students, which is great. I've seen a lot of companies, I know Intuit does it. I think GitHub has been doing a couple internships and apprenticeships for people who are career transitioners. And that's really, really exciting to see. For other folks, I learned with online resources for a few months, then I did a boot camp. Then I realized after my boot camp that I still had a couple of knowledge gaps. So I went back to those online resources. So the pathways are very varied and lots of stops and lots of different ways to do it for sure.
And I really appreciate the point you made about how the pathway is different for everyone.
Yeah.
And that there are easier paths. It can be really frustrating for some learners to see someone who does have an information-rich environment or someone who does have access to internships kind of being very successful in a way that seems a lot easier.
Yeah. And the other part about that is that a lot of people, I think, want to learn to code because of the job opportunities, but I don't think that they are necessarily clear on what their coding goals are. And that's one shift that I've seen. I've seen a lot of people say, like, I keep hearing about this thing called tech. If I get a job in this thing called tech, I will make a lot of money. What is the fastest way to get there? And so one problem with that is people end up jumping around a lot. So people say, oh, I'm going to learn Java. They do that. They realize that there are a lot of jobs in Java, but maybe there aren't a lot of entry-level jobs where you are physically located and where you're looking for jobs. Then it goes, oh man, well, let me switch to JavaScript. So now you're starting over again, a new language. And then you get some distance, you get far in that, and then you pause and think, oh, well, do I want to do front end or do I want to do back end? Oh, okay, let me do back end. So now let me learn React. So it kind of just, there's a lot of jumping around that tends to happen without a very clear goal. And if the clear goal is simply, I want to learn to code, that is just way too vague to really serve you and figure out what that pathway is for you.
That's a really fantastic point, that in order to move quickly and in order to really pick stuff up, you have to have some kind of clarity of thought. Even if it is, I want to get a job, I want to get paid a bit more. Having a clear, I'm going to be a blank dev, let's do this, gives you a little bit of a leg up.
Absolutely. I completely understand and completely respect the I want to make more money reason. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. If you're learning to code because you want a better job, you want to take care of yourself and your family, that is a perfectly legitimate reason. But if that is the goal, the first step should be, well, what are the jobs that I'm looking for? The conversation on how many jobs are available, I think, is misleading, because we say that, what's the stat? Like for every 4 open positions, there's like 1 developer or something, like whatever that number is.
Yeah.
And those numbers that's not really a fair statistic, because it's, well, how many entry-level positions are available? How many can I get with 0 experience? Because if all of those 4 or 5 open positions are all senior roles, that still cuts out the majority of people who are trying to break in. So I think that the idea of learning to code is great, but if you have an economic reason why, I think you need to work backwards and start with, what is the job that I want to end up with? What is the path to get that job? What are the skills required for that job? Now that I know that, let me use that to figure out what language and what framework I should be learning.
I really fear as well that a lot of times in our eagerness to get people on board, we say things that aren't always, they may be technically true, but they're not always especially helpful. People love to say, oh, just learn to code, it's so easy. Like, hello world.
Which is terrible.
Yeah, hello world's almost always easy. Like, hey, your coding wasn't that easy. Now just, draw the rest of the owl.
Absolutely.
But for I think this is a really good point as well for employment, that getting into employment, it is easy to say, oh, there's this huge demand, here's how much people make on average, without saying, well, there's a lot of senior roles. And even for folks who do have high demand skills, whether or not they look like or whether or not they sound like what the industry expects and where they're located can also make things really challenging once you get to the job hunt section.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've had these conversations with more senior people, and one thing that just irritates me is that I think that when you are established in any industry, I think you have a luxury and you're in a very comfortable position. And I think it's really hard to relate to that newbie struggle of, I need to get a job as soon as possible, or I'm not going to have a home to live in. And so a lot of times when I ask more experienced developers for advice, like, what language should you choose and where should you start? A lot of the advice I hear is like, oh, do things you're interested in and do things you're passionate about. And I'm like, some people can't afford to do that. Yeah, at some point, I think,
super passionate about paying my rent. Oh, sorry. We'll untangle these.
Yes, exactly. It's exactly how I feel. And like at some point, I hope that you pick a language that you're really excited about and that gets you up in the morning. But when you're first starting, yes, work-life balance would be really nice to have. But if you need to pay rent and you need to feed your family, you need to do those side projects that aren't going to be a lot of fun. You need to make those contributions that hopefully you won't have to a year or 2 into your career. But I think there's a certain sacrifice in luxury and like optimal lifestyle that needs to be taken for a lot of people purely because money is important and they need to get paid.
It's so refreshing to hear someone's talking about this. I think a lot of the advice we do give as an industry is garbage. I love your example, like, oh, do something you're passionate in. Don't compromise. Get something that I was like, but no, your first job is statistically probably going to suck. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. I would still like us to do as much as we can to reduce how much it sucks. But if you're learning to code because you want to get paid more, or you want more flexible work, or you don't want to be doing the job you're doing now, it's completely fine to not be soul-consumingly passionate about this code you're putting together.
Exactly. Like, it is okay for the job to just be a job. And by the way, like, I'm not saying tolerate toxic work environments or put up with like harassment or anything like that. Like, I think there are definitely certain lines that should not be crossed in any situation. But if the first job you have, you're not absolutely in love with, if you can tolerate Python, but you're not excited about it, that's okay. You can, I think it was Tiffany Pion who I had, she works at the New York Times, and I had her on the show to talk about the technical interview process. And she said something which to me is really interesting, where after 2 years of being a developer, you have way more opportunities than you did when you first started. So if you could just make it to that 2-year mark where you have some experience under your belt, you've networked a little bit, you've built up great relationships with other developers, you can hear about those opportunities. At that point, I think is when you have some leverage and you can say, you know what, I am going to go for that language that maybe is a little more esoteric, but I'm really excited about it and I'm going to go for it. So I think it's okay that your coding lifestyle isn't the best or the most luxurious in the beginning.
I think there's any number of CRMs out there right now, and very, very few developers who are excited to work on CRMs. Like, don't feel like you're the only one compromising.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah. Temporary compromise, I think, can be a very valuable thing.
So your community members, your lovely CodeNewbies, what kinds of challenges do they describe?
Oh, everything, a lot of things. For some people, it's the job thing. So I've been looking for a really long time. I think I'm doing all the things that people have told me I should be doing, but I'm still not able to either find that position or just get to the final rounds of the interview. So a lot of times the whiteboard interview is a problem. The technical interviews are really challenging. And that's one major component of it. The other side of it, I think, is jumping around a lot and just either getting bored with a language or worrying that like, oh, maybe I need to learn 5 things before I can be job ready. So spending 1 month per language instead of spending 5 months in one language and really getting deep in that knowledge. There are problems like just regular cultural issues of feeling like they don't fit in, either for things like gender, race, or other different axes like that, or just I don't speak tech and I'm not like a geek and I don't watch Star Wars and Star Trek. So how can I relate in terms of my hobbies and things that I'm interested in? So I think that when you're new and you weren't kind of raised in the technical culture, I think there's a lot of different barriers you can face.
This is really interesting. And in what ways do you see community members learning together?
I think that community becomes really important because it is a safe space to be vulnerable. So I think that the moment that I realized, oh, everyone has a hard time coding, oh my goodness, it became so much easier and so much more bearable when I realized that, oh, there are also other people who get excited about the background turning yellow. All of a sudden, my excitement wasn't weird. It made a lot of sense. So I think the power of community is really just validation. It's being able to validate your insecurities, your fears, your struggles, your worries. I think the moment that we realize that we are not alone in our struggle, it becomes a lot easier to deal with that struggle and overcome it.
That's fantastic. So the most valuable part of having a community to learn with is just having people who can echo your experiences and let you know that you're not out there by yourself.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So what kind of advice would you give someone who's brand new, who hasn't written a line of code, that it all sounds terrifying? What would you suggest they do first?
Yeah, I think that it is a good idea to try coding in the most low barrier to entry way. So I usually recommend Code Academy because you can just open it up in a browser and just kind of just start. And even if it doesn't totally make a lot of sense, that's okay. I think that one of the frustrating things, the most frustrating things about learning to code when you're coming from a different industry is that you're not used to being in a state of confusion for so long. I think that you know what I mean, like just that feeling of, oh, this isn't making sense. It is alarming. It's very, very concerning, I think, in most industries, but in coding, it's not supposed to make sense until the last little bit of time that you spend on it, and then all of a sudden it falls into place. And for me, especially for me coming from like journalism, where I love telling stories and I love interviewing people and talking to people, I like a world where there is a very clear beginning, middle, and end. I like to know who the characters are. I want to know what their conflict is, and I want a resolution. And in tech, that narrative doesn't always exist. And if it does, it doesn't always reveal itself until the very end of a feature that you're building. And so for me, one of the things that I just had to accept that I think is just really healthy is that if it doesn't make sense most of the time, that is not abnormal. That's what it's like to research and get stuck. And you will be in that place of uncertainty, of chaos a lot longer than you're used to.
That's fantastic advice. I would wonder, would your advice to somebody who's tried a couple of times and keeps taking breaks or keeps coming back or keeps giving up, would you have different advice to give that potential learner?
Yeah, I would say find your community as soon as you possibly can. And that community might be, it might be CodeNewbies. Hopefully it's CodeNewbies, but it might be if there's a Learn to Code class happening at your local library. That's one thing I'm really excited about is a lot of local institutions, community colleges, libraries and such are making an effort to really make coding more accessible. So if that's joining a local community in person, if that's going to a meetup, if that's attending a conference that's about code, whatever that is for you, whether it's a Slack community, find other people as soon as you can and be a support system to them. And hopefully there'll be a support system to you. I think that's the number one thing. I think the sooner you can find people who are on that journey with you, the better it's going to be, the easier it's going to be. And at the same time, when you take advice from senior developers, figure out if they are happy with their developer lives first before before you incorporate their advice. Because one thing I ran into when I first started is I talked to a lot of developers, but they were really jaded and really bitter and very, they weren't excited about tech anymore. And they had like lost a lot of that interest. So it was very discouraging at the very beginning. I had a lot of people say things like, oh, well, you're such a strong communicator and you're so outgoing that like, you don't need to do tech, like tech isn't for you. So just be careful of the advice that you get from people. Make sure it's someone that hopefully you aspire to be in some way, that can relate to you in some way. Not all senior developer advice is equally applicable to you and your situation. So just be careful about how seriously you take other people's opinions.
I love this meta look at advice where it's like, hey, my advice is be deeply suspicious of advice.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. So, on the CodeNewbie podcast, one of the questions that I end with all the guests is I ask, what's the worst advice you've ever received? And that's exactly why, because I think that we're so, we like the idea of saying, what do you think I should do? And I think we rarely stop to consider, wait a minute, does that actually make sense to me in my role, in my life? So I like to ask that question at the end to kind of remind people that, for some people, that advice that this guest received was amazing, but to this guest, it did not work out. So it's okay to screen and filter the advice you receive based on your situation.
Oh, wow, that's really convenient. We're actually going to be airing a special podcast episode with Scott Hanselman talking about the worst advice people have ever gotten.
That's awesome.
So if you did have people who were really interested in getting involved, they're like, wow, you know what? You've convinced me. This is what I truly believe. A community is what I need. Where can they find CodeNewbies?
Ooh, great question. My favorite question so far. You can go to www.codenewbie.org. That's where we have all the information on the projects that we're currently working on. So you'll find our podcast. We actually have two podcasts. One is the CodeNewbie podcast. The other is called the Base CS podcast, which teaches computer science fundamentals in 20, 25 minutes minute podcast episodes. We also have our upcoming conference called Codeland that's happening May 4 and 5 in New York City. We have a bunch of blog posts that we do. We're also doing the CodeNewbie Challenge, which is this like email-based New Year's resolution thing that we're doing, which is awesome. So that's like a good stop to kind of check out all the things that we do. For more active engagement, we're very active on Facebook. We have the CodeNewbie Facebook group. We have lots of amazing people talking about their journey and their struggles and their wins on there. And then Twitter at CodeNewbies. We host 2 Twitter chats a week, Wednesdays at 9 p.m. Eastern time. And then we do a Sunday coding check-in at 2 p.m. Eastern time.
That all sounds fantastic. And I know you said that this is your full-time job, but I got tired just listening to that list. That's so much.
I have some help. I'm finally able to afford some help, which is very, very exciting. But yeah, it's a lot of stuff. I work all the time.
What's coming down the pipeline? What's maybe next, if you can give us a sneak peek for what kinds of stuff CodeNewbies is going to be doing in the future?
Yeah, the main thing right now is we are gearing up for season 2 of the Base CS podcast. Season 1 took off, frankly, way better than I thought it was going to. I was worried when you try to teach a technical topic through audio, when you can't see anything, you can't reread something, you can't like skim. It's a funny and interesting medium to try and teach with, but it's worked out really, really well. People really, really like it. It's been really amazing. So season 2 for that is something we're working on. And then our focus right now is Codeland, our conference. It's the second year that we're doing it. We're expecting about 300 people in New York City. We did it last year and it was, oh my goodness, it was so magical, especially for me because everything I do is online. You know, all my interactions are through the internet. And so being able to walk into a space and see that like everyone there is a CodeNewbie and has been active on Twitter and been part of the community, and being able to see them and hear their stories and see their faces, it was absolutely amazing. So super excited for that.
That sounds absolutely delightful. And that's coming up this May in New York.
Yep, May 4 and 5.
Fantastic. If you could leave all of us, our maybe dear listener, some advice, some parting advice on what we could do as individuals, whether or not we're new or we've been in the community for ages, what we could do as individuals to make tech overall a little bit friendlier for newbies.
Ooh, I like that. I think one technique that I've used personally that's been really helpful is to just assume that people mean well in general. You know, I think that especially when we're communicating with people through the internet, whether it's Twitter or a discussion forum, I know that I personally tend to get very like defensive. If I tweet something or say something and someone responds or doesn't like what I said, I realize that as I read what they say, I hear like a very harsh, critical voice in my head. And what I've started to do is say, okay, let's use a different voice. Let's read the exact same response, but assume that this person is my best friend. Then what does it sound like? And when I've done that, I realize that, oh, it's just a conversation. They're not trying to make me feel bad or make me feel stupid or attack me. It's just a difference of opinion. And I think that when we are reading things, when we're communicating online, it's really, really easy for our own insecurities, for our own personal reasons to get defensive and feel attacked and feel guarded. And I think those are the moments when potentially productive conversations turn into unnecessary fights online. And so my advice is the next time you read something that maybe you don't like or, maybe rubs you the wrong way, see what it sounds like if you assume that it was your partner saying it or your best friend saying it, and read it with love and with an open mind. And you might find that the message is completely different and opens you up to being more conversational and more supportive.
That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you again for joining us.
You're so welcome. Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you, dear listener, for joining us this week. If you come back next week, we're going to be having a special guest on who's going to talk to us about having tried to learn to code, but had it not quite work out. Don't worry, they've got a fantastic job in tech. Join us next week to get the full story.